All right. We're going to move on to chapter 15 now. The title in your book is says this is on ethnicity and race, but I like to define this a little bit more broadly, and I'd like to talk about identity. Because really what humans aren't composed of just one thing. Nobody is one-dimensional. Or even two-dimensional. We have a lot of layers. We're like onions, where you can peel back one and there's another and another and another. But onion isn't a great analogy either, because we share these identities. We've talked about how culture exists between us as well as within us. So we have different identities in different contexts. And this is what's called the situational negotiation of social identity. So you can be let's just use myself here. I was raised a Catholic. So there is an anthropological identity that I share with other people that were raised Catholic. I have background, my biological background is my ancestors came from Northern and Western Europe. So I share that with other people. I look a particular way. I have a particular educational level. I live in a part of the world. I have a national identity. I'm a citizen of a country. I like certain types of music or sports or that sort of a thing. I actually don't like sports, but that's okay. But I have these things and they overlap like in Venn diagrams, right? So some are great big groups that I share with people around the world. Some are much smaller groups, which I only share with a few dozen people. And these are all identities that overlap, and in different contexts, they become more dominant or prominent. Some I like to keep hidden. Some I don't like to share with other people and put out there in the open all the time. And they only come through when I'm within that group. Others I wear on a sleeve and I express all the time, or are obvious just from looking at me. So our identities are not always constrained by our physical attributes. And we can use modern communications and technology, I'm doing it right now, to bring you into, let's say, the anthropological community, right? So we're now all anthropologists, and you can include yourself in that group, but I'm not even physically talking to you. So you can have identities that you share with other people around the world, whether you've ever interacted with them or not. Some important identities that exist within humans are what we call ethnic groups and ethnicity. We talked already in previous classes about biological concept of race has been discredited. It is not a valid concept in biology. And the reason for this is because if we want to draw a ring around a group of people and say, here is a group of people that I can classify because they have this particular skin color. When you look at their biology, that group of people, there's actually more genetic diversity within that group that you've drawn a ring around than between them and the next group. So biology does not find any value in the definition of the word race at all. There is no biological race except one, the human race. We are all the same race. So what is, and we'll come back to the concept of race in a little bit, because the concept of race is the assumption of biological shared characteristics, but biology rejects that. Does that mean that we don't use that in our common culture? Yes, we do. We're mistaken about it, but we use it. So it exists. And as a cultural concept, we have race. As a biological concept, it does not exist. What we do have, however, and is something that is not necessarily based on biology, but it overlaps with race, and in fact, races can be within this, is ethnicity. So, members of an ethnic group usually share beliefs, values, habits, customs, and norms because of a common background. Now, that background doesn't have to be biological. You can be an adopted child in a Hasidic Jewish community someplace, and you may have a complete different biology because you were adopted. Does that mean that you are not sharing the beliefs, values, habits, customs, and norms? No, you are, and you can be brought into an ethnic group. It's possible to do that. And so members of an ethnic group may define themselves as different or special through cultural distinctions such as things like language or religion, geography, history, ancestor, or even this biological misconception of race. And an ethnicity is your identification with, your sense of feeling a part of or excluded from, and sometimes, an ethnic group, and exclusion from certain other groups because of that affiliation. And likewise, you can share different ethnicities at the same time. And this, once again, we saw this before, you can have status shifting. You can enter into a particular group and behave according to a particular set of norms and standards, and you can enter into another group with another set of norms and behaviors. You can also transition from one group to another. So for social scientists, this concept of status refers to the various positions that people occupy within society. Some of these statuses are what we call ascribed, which means that you have little or no choice in the matter of occupying them. So your age, for instance, you have no choice as to how old you are. Your race is usually a perception of other people. You have no choice in that either. Your gender, you often have no choice in what other people perceive to be your gender as well. Whereas achieved statuses, in contrast to ascribed statuses, are ones that your own choices, your actions, your efforts, your talents, or your achievements can be either positive or negative, and it can put you into another category. So, for instance, I have an achieved status of I'm doctor. I have a PhD. I achieved that. That has put me into a particular status. Someone who is a salesperson for a company, that's a status that they have. That's an achieved status. But also things like being a felon convicted of a crime is an achievement that you've done. It's not necessarily have to be a positive achievement, but it puts you into a particular category. Being a mother or a father, that's another category that you have achieved. Sometimes these are mutually exclusive. So sometimes you, like for instance, when you go from a particular age to another age, you can't be both. You can't be both a child and an adult at the same time. And some statuses are not mutually exclusive, but can be held at the same time. And you have the option to switch between these in different social contexts, which is again the situational negotiation of social identity that we talked about at the start of this lesson. Contrary to ethnicity, race is assumed to have a biological basis, that is to say, distinctively shared heritage or genes, but it is, we've seen that biologically that doesn't make any sense, but that doesn't mean that human cultures don't use this assumption of shared blood or genes as a way to identify groups of people. And discrimination of a group that is identified as a race is called racism. Race, like ethnicity in general, is a cultural category rather than a biological reality. And this can derive, race can derive from contrasts perceived in particular societies rather than from a scientific classifications based on common genes. And so it's culturally specific. It is an emic perspective. This is a little confusing because in at least in our own language, we use often the terms race and ethnicity interchangeably. But anthropologists separate these two as different concepts, and they're very clearly delineated. Ethnicity tends to be the larger of those two categories, whereas race can be a subset of an ethnicity. An ethnicity can be comprised of a single race, but you can have an ethnicity that has multiple races within it. And so ethnicity tends to be the larger of those two categories. So race and ethnicity is socially constructed. Race is a commonly an ascribed status, that it's something that you don't achieve your racial categorization. This is something that is perceived and you have very little choice about it. And in fact, in America, it's practiced what's called hypodescent, which is that if you come from a mixed background where someone who has a particular racial characteristics or racially ascribed characteristics and someone who has other racially ascribed characteristics produce offspring, that offspring is usually included in the minority category. This is what's called hypodescent. So Barack Obama was not the first black president. His mother was white and his father was black, and he was of mixed descent. But culturally, because of hypodescent, he is placed into the minority category, as most people are. And so he would be assumed to be black, even though he is 50% from a white background and 50% from a black background. And also, cultures require you sometimes to choose what your racial category is. I personally take great offense at this, but because as I might have discussed before, I have to choose the term Caucasian, which has very racist background. It assumes that there's a very problematic background to the term Caucasian, which goes to Aryan, the assumption of an Aryan master race. And I don't ascribe to that. I don't like that. But on a census, which in 2020 the census is coming out, and that will be, I will have to tick a box that will require me to say I am Caucasian, which I do not necessarily ascribe to. As we talked about, races are not biological, so it is culturally ascribed. So what race you are is largely not your choice in the matter. But attempts to separate into multiracial categories has been resisted from a sort of counterintuitive source. Some of these, the attempts to differentiate between races has been resisted by things like the National Council of La Raza and NAACP, because there's strength in greater numbers. And so even though African American communities or Hispanic communities are extremely diverse and don't always get along in terms of subgroups, these large representative bodies don't want to see their efforts split. They don't want to have multiracial categories that would actually draw power away from them. And so the actually attempts to put on this things like the census, multiracial categories, has actually gotten pushback from the communities that actually could be represented as multiracial. race in our country and in other countries, in America and elsewhere, is a way to define who you are, but also how to define what the other is. In places like Japan, for instance, there's a group of people called the Burukamin, which are kind of like the untouchables. They're a class of people that you are that you have no choice in entering because you're born into that community. Japan largely considers themselves to be ethnically and racially homogenous, and these people are from centuries ago considered to, some of them have come from places like Korea. So immigrant communities coming into Japan but have lived there for centuries are considered to be an underclass, and ethnically so, even if that is not biologically an issue anymore, if there's been integration and they're just as Japanese. This is what's called intrinsic racism, which is a belief that a perceived racial difference is a sufficient reason to value a person less than another. This is something that the world has seen many times. The Western European and American culture has a very shameful history of this intrinsic racism because of perceived racial differences valuing groups of people less. This is the cause of things like the Holocaust. And so you also see it in other countries, although the India's untouchables are now outlawed as a group, it still persists culturally. It's very hard to do away with. A stroke of a pen as a law saying it's banned is really hard to implement when people are actually living their lives culturally. Also, the number of races is something that we tend to think of as a fixed quantity because because we're looking at it from our own cultural perspective. But for instance, we tend to say black or white, but in Japan, in Brazil, there are 500 different racial labels that have been reported. And so there's a hyper distinction between racial and ethnic groups in Brazil, whereas we tend to be lumpers. And I talked about some of the reasons why there's resistance to have multiracial categories or to split these up. There's more power in numbers, but other countries, other cultures actually like to split things into an almost limitless number of ethnic and cultural groups. Also, and we've been talking about ethnic groups, racial groups, but also things like nationalities can be something that is an identity that forms. A nationalism studies scholar named Anderson wrote a book called Imagined Communities, and these were Benedict Anderson. Imagined communities are national identities that actually form an identity of selfhood around something that really is just borders on a map, boundaries on a map. One of the classic examples of this was what's called Arab nationalism. Many of the states in the Middle East, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Turkey, Israel, Palestine, Egypt, all of these were created by the stroke of a pen after World War I with the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. These countries didn't exist before the end of World War I, and Europeans came in and drew boundaries around where natural resources were. Iraq was drawn around where the oil was. And so it became perplexing to Europeans when in the middle of the 20th century you started to have revolutions and nationalism around the flags of these countries Europeans were perplexed because they're like, wait a minute, we invented your country. How can you be nationalistic? How can you have an identity around something that's completely imaginary and we invented it? Doesn't matter. They still felt pride in their country. So Iraqis were Iraqis, even though that was a community that was invented by the victors of World War I in Europe. So nationalism can be as powerful of an identifier as any other kind of identity. Joining a community can be done through another being accommodating to different identities can be done from a number of different perspectives. So you can assimilate groups, which is process of change when a minority group or ethnic group adopts the patterns and norms of its dominant host culture. This can be forced or it can be chosen, depending on historical reasons. You can have a pluralistic society where multi-ethnic nation states, where ethnic groups who do not assimilate but remain essentially distinctive remain in a stable coexistence. This is the sort of salad bowl theory of society. You can also have multiculturalism, which is the view that cultural diversity in a country is something that's good and desirable. So you can have blends through assimilation, you can have pluralism, and you can have the view that multiculturalism is good. But you can also have prejudice, discrimination, and you can have stereotypes, fixed ideas, often unfavorable about what members of a specific group are perceived to be like. And these bad effects of racial and identity discrimination can find their expressions in things like genocide, which is the deliberate elimination of a religious or ethnic group, ethnocide, which is forced assimilation, ethnic expulsion, or even things like cultural colonialism, which refers to the internal domination by one group and its cultural ideology over others. All right, I'll let you read more about this, but that's the basic ideas about identity formation and some of those